Good morning or good afternoon or good evening whenever you are tuning in to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And quickly, I hope everyone can stick around to the second half of the show today because I have a little announcement about some things that are happening with the show, thanks to a listener feedback. Okay. Ooh, not even Emily knows, so this is exciting. Welcome to the show, regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of 3 reps from Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Olga. So nice to see you.
So nice to see you too. And Chloe Learey, Executive Director of the Winston Prouty Center for Child and Family Development. Good to see you. Long time no see.
It has been a while. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, as people can guess, if you know Chloe, you know she has been working on the issue of childcare in Vermont for many, many years now. So I bet you can guess that we're talking about childcare today. And that is true. We're discussing S56, which is a bill around childcare and early education and the pre-K system in Vermont. It has gone through the Senate. It has now landed in the House and is currently with the House Committee on Human Services. And the bill aims to do a few things. It aims to increase access to childcare in the state, also hopes to stabilize a few aspects of childcare, for example, financial stability for the programs themselves, stabilize some issues in the workforce that people have been experiencing, and also to provide some policy recommendations around capacity in the pre-K system. And I think the first step it will be taking, if it passes, is to establish a study committee. Now, Emily, you have also been working on childcare for a long time. This is one of many bills around childcare to go through the State House in many years. How is this bill different? What is it? Is it filling new gaps that maybe we hadn't seen before? Like, how does this fit into that big landscape of childcare legislation?
Yeah, so this is an issue that we have studied extensively. And I think there's some questions about whether or not the bill will leave the House with studies in it, because we have studied this one. And so what we did last biennium what we did a couple of years ago was set out a real roadmap for how to create an affordable, accessible, high-quality childcare system in Vermont. And we did that in partnership with a wide variety of stakeholders, with the Agency of Human Services Child Development Division, with Building Bright Futures, which is the statewide early childhood partnership, and with Let's Grow Kids, who has been leading a very, very, very robust advocacy campaign for a number of years now in order to actually meet this transformation. And so we put in place this roadmap, and what the roadmap said is that, by a certain point, no Vermont family is going to pay more than 10% of their income for early care and education services. And folks who work in early care and education are going to be making wages commensurate with their skills and education and skill set. And so by changing both of those sort of resource allocations, the idea is that we're going to be sort of fixing the entire early care and education system via this 3-legged stool, right? And the 3-legged stool is basically like, fixing families' ability to pay, adequate compensation. And the idea is that by creating adequate compensation you will increase both the quality of the care being provided, and you will have an adequate number of folks providing that care with high skills in order to have that be a high quality system. So it's affordable, accessible, high quality. So you make it accessible by making it affordable for families, and to have enough childcare slots. You make enough childcare slots by making sure the folks working in those organizations get paid enough, and you make it high quality by being really clear about sort of standards and education levels and all that. So we set in place that plan. We made a promise to do it. And this legislation is the legislation that actually does it. It actually figures out where all of those dollars are going to come from and where all of those standards are going to come from to make this happen. We put in place that roadmap before the pandemic, and then the pandemic came and, did lots of things. But one of the things it did was it decimated the early care and education workforce because they were frontline workers working with little creatures that are already terrible germ factories who, cannot reasonably wear masks for long periods of time. And, we know what's happened with wages. Their wages didn't change, but they were doing even harder work in an environment where higher wages were more accessible elsewhere. And we also, in sort of the decimating of the early care and education workforce during the pandemic, we also hypothetically all realized how important childcare is for families and the workforce in Vermont. Some of us knew that before, but hypothetically, that was one of the lessons learned.
Yes, was that new for you, Chloe, that realization?
Right, no. Yeah, there are many people, we are standing on the shoulders of many people before us who have been talking about this in Vermont for 30 years. So it's great that everybody's come along to acknowledge the problem now. But, I think it's, Emily, it's such a great point of like the three-legged stool and all the pieces. I think childcare is a really complicated market, and all those variables are really impacting us. This bill, I think it'll be, sometimes we fix things and we don't know what the impact is going to be, but I do think the elements are here for it to work, for families to be able to afford it, more families, and for us to stay in business. I will say, over the past, it's really hard to compete for workers right now. And our wages, I was thinking about it last night, we're up to minimum paying $15 an hour, which doesn't sound like a lot to some people, but that's from $12 an hour 2 years ago. I mean, I don't know how we're doing it, because the only way you can raise wages is to raise tuition. But if you raise tuition, that's sitting on the backs of families. So I'm hoping that this, this access to financial assistance for more families will help at least close some of that gap. But even by increasing wages to $15 for entry level, people just aren't applying. I think it's true in many sectors too. I think childcare is, one of many, but it's really hard. We're going back down to 4 classrooms. So when we opened here, we had 6 classrooms. We reopened with 4 after COVID. And then we added a 5th one in the fall, September 21, with the hopes of being able to, we can't do it. We can't carry it. We're going back to 4 classrooms. So it is tough. I hope this bill happens in time to save us, so to speak.
And so I think a lot of organizations were able to do raises in some ways because of some COVID era grants that were lump sum payments. And so we've been sort of trying to duct tape the system together a little bit with these lump sum payments. But what that last bill that set out that roadmap did was also commission a massive study done by the Rand Corporation that looked at what is the true cost of care and how much can families afford, and how do those two things fit together. And so essentially they built out how much would it cost to have childcare for the majority of kids birth to 5 in Vermont, where the folks who worked in those places made sort of essentially comparable to kindergarten public school teacher salaries, and had benefits and had administrators who had time to administer rather than teach, those kinds of things. Had adequate mental health wraparound supports for kids who were having challenges, so that, teachers could, anyway, all those things, sort of strengthen the system and pay adequately for that. And then do that in a way that, again, families were paying no more than 10%. So how much extra public money is needed to go into that system? So right now, there are a lot of families who don't pay more than 10% of their income for childcare. And that's subsidized through a program called CCFAP, Child Care Financial Assistance Program. But that's mostly very low income families. And then many programs charge a copay on top of that, because that amount that's paid by the state to childcare programs maxes out at a fairly low tuition level. And so some programs charge really high copays on top of that might or might not be affordable for families. And some programs make do without those copays because they want their programs to be accessible to more families. And so it also creates this huge inequities in sort of where the money's going and how the system is working. So the idea is that we would the bill as it's moving, creates a massive increase in CCFAP payments and changes things in little ways that are probably not as interesting to listeners, but are very interesting and important for stabilizing the system. But massive increase in the payments from the state on behalf of families, and then figures out a way to pay for that.
I don't know if this is a Chloe question or an Emily question. One thing that stood out to me when I was looking at the bill was not just discussing about childcare, but framing in a way of pre-K. Vermont's pre-kindergarten system. Is that just a change in language, or is that a new concept? Walk me through that, please.
They're two entirely different systems.
Okay.
And integrated systems. So one of the ways Vermont tried to have affordable, accessible childcare a number of years ago was a law called Act 166 that created universal pre-kindergarten in Vermont. And what that was each school district pays for a student who's either 3 or 4 for 10 hours a week of early education services. And some districts provide that in their school buildings, and sometimes it's full day, even though they only have to offer 10 hours. And sometimes it's just 10 hours and the parents need to truck the kids somewhere else. And then some programs, some school districts just pay 10 hours out of school district money rather than out of the CCFAP money. So it's two different funding sources that sometimes provide the same service and sometimes don't provide the same service. It is an incredibly irrational system that makes everything 10 times more complicated than it needs to be. Chloe, add more.
Yeah, so what that looks like in Brattleboro and surrounding towns, I'm trying to think. So the schools don't have the capacity to offer that. So there are some classrooms that have Dummerston, Guilford, Oak Grove. I don't think Academy has one. So some schools have one. And then those of us in the community who are pre-K partners, we get pass-through money essentially for tuition. So families get a little over $3,000 off their tuition for those 10 hours. So it's a partnership around that bill. And it is complicated. I think the fact that it's 10 hours for 35 weeks a year, it's sort of it's a cultural mismatch in some ways in the way we think about school versus early care and education. So I think early care and education is really about the whole life and family and the whole, we understand versus, school is, this set amount of time in this building and not whatever. Never mind. I shouldn't go there, but
you are more than welcome to, though.
no, I'm going down that rabbit hole. So, and I am curious about this bill, if and whether all 4-year-olds, whatever the proposal is about full day preschool, that schools have to offer that to all 4-year-olds. That is a part of the web that I'm a little curious about. But I hear, Emily, what you're saying, let's not study this stuff anymore. I think we know what we need to do. And that makes me a little nervous. That piece definitely not sitting, and part of it's because the uncertainty in the market. So essentially, we lose families. They get on the waiting list for their preschool in their town, and then they leave us when they're, 4 because they got a slot in the school that's free. We can't compete with free. So of course they're going to go to the school-based preschool. But what that does in childcare is the way it works financially is infant toddler care is more expensive than preschool care, right? Because of the ratio. And so you kind of need
ratio of what?
Right, thank you. Ratio of teachers to kids. So infants, you have to have one teacher. The most you can have is 4 infants per 1 teacher. I would argue that can be very hard if they're all crying at once, but we'll talk about that.
Or they all need their diaper changed at once.
Exactly. That's a little tricky. And then preschoolers is 1 to 10, one teacher for 10 kids. So, if you look at that whole financial puzzle, you kind of need the whole continuum to make it work, or it makes it easier to make it work. So when we lose a bunch of preschoolers, suddenly it's heavy on the infant toddler side, and then that will drive costs up for the families with infants and toddlers. So it's a puzzle. I think I'm more curious about how that would impact the market. How will the market change because of this bill? And I don't know about, how it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds that way.
Like in that pre-K system, when school districts are, say, paying Winston Prouty for pre-kindergarten partnership care, they're paying just a flat sum, a fairly small amount of money. But when they're providing that exact same care within their school building, they're paying cost of care there. And so some districts are spending way more money on this. Some are spending way less. Some parents are getting way more services. Some are getting way less services, but it's all being paid for out of the statewide education fund. And so it's an aspect of the system that needs fixing. The direction it needs fixing in, I think, is really up for debate, but right now it's like very irrational and inequitable. But this problem of 4-year-olds essentially like being an important part of stabilizing a totally unstable sector of our entire service system and community is huge. And so I guess my curiosity is if in 4 years we've actually paid cost of care for birth to 3, would the 4-year-old still be needed in order to sort of stabilize the system?
Right. And we don't know that.
Yeah.
And what would it look like in terms of, again, like our schools don't have the capacity, or some school districts have the space to do it and others don't. But if it's a system where it's still mixed delivery and private providers can still serve those 4-year-olds and the money is just coming from a school district versus somewhere else. I think that could be great. That could work.
Yeah.
I would hate to see. I think the mixed delivery system is really important, even as you get to the 4-year-olds. Families.
What is a mixed delivery system? So that's like one of the catchphrases that super floats around this conversation space. I worked in sort of early childhood systems before I joined the legislature, but most of my colleagues didn't. And it is just like, what is a mixed delivery system? Because is it like you get bread and eggs? What does it even mean?
So the way I use it, what I mean is families need choice about where they want their littlest people to get care. So, we've definitely had families come to Winston Prouty and then they figure out, my kid needs to be in a smaller setting. And so they go to a family-based childcare program because it's much better for them and that kid. Like there's not a one size fits all. And public school can be a little bit one size fits all. So that would be my worry. That we keep options open for families to make choices about where they want their children to go.
So, and just on a practical term, mixed delivery, it sounds like it's a mix of public and private.
And it's not just public and private. The idea is, so the spectrum of the private is just as important. So the spectrum of the private is some huge centers, right? And Prouty is on the larger side for Windham County, but I don't think even on the larger side for Vermont statewide. And then smaller centers where it's sort of like a building that people go to access care, but might just have 2 classrooms in it, right? Or it's someone providing home-based care, which is just a few families and sort of like 1 adult or 2 adults providing care, where it's basically like, it is heavily monitored for sort of quality control and regulated, but it is essentially like, having children into your home in order to care for them the same way you would for like, a neighbor or a family member. And then, in some systems, there's also sort of the family and friends care, which is has subsidies connected to it, but is not necessarily always considered part of the mixed delivery system. And so it's that whole spectrum. And that includes it includes the church basement care. It includes massive Burlington area has some massive for-profit childcare systems that are now like owned by venture capital firms and are, pulling corporate profits off the backs of parents. So like mixed delivery is a wide range.
Yeah, I was just looking at that article from 7 Days about the private equity firms owning 6 Vermont childcare centers. So definitely digging into that and how this bill and, might by increasing resources into childcare, they're going to attract more of that kind of investment. And how do we protect against that, which I think is a great question. So, yeah,
I would love to dive into that little corner of this conversation because I don't think it's getting as much as attention as it maybe should. Olga, is it okay if we do that now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there's been private equity in early care and learning on the West Coast for quite a while. And I think like a little bit in the sort of like New York to DC corridor. But it is very new to Vermont. And as more money comes into the system, obviously there'll be more interest in it from private equity. And I think it's a really interesting part of the conversation because all of the talk policy-wise is we're massively increasing the money going to early care and education centers in order to pay higher wages, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea of having wage thresholds or wage caps or anything like that, I think is a really nerve-wracking for some legislators and for some centers because it sort of like reeks of a strong union presence, right? And I think folks are sort of nervous about like whatever that slippery slope might be of sort of those guaranteed wages. Like we have that, in construction contracts, right? But I personally don't see another way of guaranteeing that money is going where it's supposed to be going. And why would we massively increase those public payments to private providers if it wasn't going to pay salaries?
Yeah, it's either got to be going to salaries or the kids.
Right. I mean, one of the single biggest cost is wages, right? We're a people business, so it's the people who work in the business that that we need to invest in. And right, somebody would say, well, then people just won't work there if they can go get a job somewhere else making more. Theoretically, I think that what that does is just create more inequity, right? Then the people who can't access whatever, it will end up paying some people less.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is an interesting question. And then I wonder if there's a way, there are certain stipulations. So if you're a program that accepts CCFAP or financial assistance, there are guidelines around that. So, maybe there is a way to write that in that doesn't necessarily, I don't know. That's interesting. How can we, from a policy perspective, leave some flexibility around wages and not be too prescriptive, but still accomplish the same goal? I mean, and Emily, I'd be curious what you think. Like when policy gets too prescriptive, it's not always effective. So I think
absolutely,
it's a fine line to walk, but I think it's definitely worth exploring because
and I also worry, so let's say one center, if we're sort of prescribing the same amount of money as going out from the state for each child, and we're prescribing wage thresholds, but the costs do have some variation from center to center, right? Like your property costs might be higher or lower depending. At a larger center, you might have sort of like more senior staff, but that's probably, still like you're getting better economies of scale than you would at a smaller center. And so there's just like all kinds of really interesting questions about sort of providing that flexibility. Or if you provide specialized care, would you have the staff dollars available to pay for that specialized care? If you have to put it all into these very specific wage brackets, how does that work out? It's a really interesting piece of the puzzle. And it's an issue that we resolve in public schools via union contracts. And there's been sort of this long-standing resistance in the early care and education space around unionization. And it's hard to do because it's sort of this patchwork of very small centers and, very tight relationships. And so that I don't think that is necessarily the solution in this space, but I think some of the sort of tools around wage thresholds might serve.
So we have just a couple minutes before the the end of this first half, and I just want to tie this back up because we came into this conversation around private equity firms becoming involved in childcare. So I think we're hinting at some concerns, but I would just like to get a little more specific and tie things up for listeners before we head out. What is the concern and or benefit of private equity firms in childcare? Like, how can we tie this up and make it a little explicit for our listeners?
I think the concern around having private equity firms involved in childcare is that they would need to, in order to make profit, be sort of scraping profit out of the classroom. And so that would be, either cutting costs with teacher salaries or food services or quality of, things in the classroom, whatever it is. And which is, fine on some level, except this is public dollars that we're sort of putting into the system explicitly in order to increase accessibility and care. And so it's public dollars that are being used for a private goal that's not sort of part of that public goal. I think that's sort of the summation of it.
And if they decide not to use public dollars, so part of the article I read was they see Vermont as a market where there's some portion of the population who is happy to pay a lot of money for care. So they'll just jack up tuition, and that makes it sort of creates a segregated system. It's like the private school, function of suddenly we have these high-end boutique fancy, maybe that's fine, but they shouldn't get public dollars to do that. So.
Yeah. And as, similarly, sort of as health insurance has gotten more and more complicated for doctors to deal with, let alone for patients to deal with, we're seeing those sort of private concierge service medical practices where you pay a monthly fee as a private person and you receive whatever care is needed. And it would be sort of it would be the childcare version of that, essentially.
Fantastic. Thank you, both of you, for helping to sum that up. And I thought that's what you were kind of hinting at, but I wanted to make sure we were being clear for listeners. So thank you very much. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return right after a word from our underwriters. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser, and Chloe Learey, who is the Executive Director of the Winston Prouty Center here in Brattleboro. And if you are a regular listener to the Happy Hour, you know that you can find us at 2 p.m. on Friday on WVEW. You can also find us thanks to BCTV on many PEG stations around Vermont. We have our podcast, and then of course BCTV with the video version of us. We are just everywhere. Well, thanks to some input from a listener, we will also be rebroadcasting the Happy Hour on Wednesdays at 8 a.m. on WVEW for folks who miss it on Fridays. I want to thank Zeke for bringing that to our attention, and I want to thank John at WVEW for making the rebroadcast happen. So how will this work? Basically, we will broadcast a new episode every Friday at 2. So, for example, our episode that went out on the 7th of April will then be rebroadcast at 8 a.m. on Wednesday, so the 12th, which is coming up. And then again, this episode that comes out on the 14th will be rebroadcast on the 19th, and so on. So if you miss us on Fridays, you can catch us Wednesday mornings at 8 a.m. too.
Wow,
so
we're like rush hour lilisteners.
We really are. We're drive time.
We are a drive time show. So another thing folks should know about our radio time is that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests respectively, and not of the station, nor platform, nor neighbors, friends, or employers.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much. Let's talk about getting back to S56. which is looking at childcare. Part of the intent of this bill is to stabilize the childcare system financially and also the workforce. How are we going to do that, though? How are we going to pay for these things?
So the idea is that we will find public money so that the amount of money that's paid from the Child Care Financial Assistance Program to early care and education centers will be a lot more money per child. So it essentially is paying for cost of care rather than just subsidizing cost of care. And then simultaneously, we will change the percentage of the poverty level, essentially, that families get full subsidy under, and sort of the copay that goes with that. And so what that looks like is that on various versions of the bill that have floated around, it could be 300% of poverty level, someone gets full subsidy, 400% of poverty level, someone gets full subsidy. But subsidy then sort of continues as a percentage, a low percentage of income, really up until, families making $200,000 a year in some cases. So that as the cost of care goes up, there isn't this sort of cliff where all of a sudden a family is paying $50,000 a year and they're making $125,000 a year, right? And so the CCFAP pot needs to get much bigger. And so there are various proposals around that. As it passed the Senate, this was being funded through a payroll tax. The reasoning behind their use of the payroll tax was that a lot of the call for these really significant reforms comes not just from families and early care and education centers, but from businesses and the business community who feel like this will be a really important way that they can stabilize their own workforce. Because if folks have childcare, then folks can work. And so they were looking for a tax where businesses and individuals were sort of paying their share. I think there are I think Vermont's economy is sort of particularly diverse in the way income is accounted for. And a huge number of Vermonters do not have wages, sort of traditional wages, right? We've talked about this on the show so much. So many Vermonters are not on payroll or don't have the majority of their income via payroll.
Right.
And so many businesses don't actually pay their profits in the form of a corporate tax or in the form of a payroll tax. Many, many, many Vermont businesses, most Vermont profit, because they are smaller businesses and are organized as partnerships or LLCs, pay through pass-through entities, which then comes to the income tax. So most business profits are taxed via the income tax, not through sort of other taxes that folks generally think of. And so the payroll tax actually is hitting a very narrow slice of Vermont workers and a very narrow slice of Vermont businesses. And so I think there's a lot of questions about whether, if the goal is to make sure that businesses and workers are both paying their fair share, that that's necessarily the best possible choice. Mm-hmm. I also have some questions about if, I think Americans generally think of payroll taxes as a tax that we use for insurance programs. That's how we pay into Social Security. That's how we pay into unemployment. I think there's sort of comfort with doing that with family medical leave insurance, because again, that's an insurance program. But childcare, for the vast majority of folks, isn't something that they access as a direct benefit. It's an indirect benefit. It strengthens their communities. It lowers the costs of, public school. It strengthens workforce and employers and all of that. But it's not, it makes our communities healthier and happier. But it's not necessarily something that most Vermonters are using sort of directly within a 5-year time frame, especially given our demographics. And so I think there might be a broader based tax that might be more appropriate in this case. And that's something that, the House is going to spend quite a bit of time working on this spring.
I'm curious to hear from Chloe. I can see from your face that you're listening to this. How are we going to pay for it very intently? What are you hearing now, or what does your ground level experience tell you about paying for childcare?
Yeah, I mean, I was listening intently because I don't think I realized that the payroll tax hit such a narrow slice of businesses and individuals. So I was learning something. Thank you. That's really great. I mean, I think that just on the face of it, tuition, so tuition at Winston Prouty, now if you're a new family coming here, it's going to be $1,200 a month for tuition. That's more than people pay for housing. Well, no, that's not true.
At one point it was, now not so much.
Right. And so I think that again, in this post-COVID world, when people understand better why childcare is important, I think that question of how to pay for it is, it feels like people are more open to talking about it getting paid for publicly. So
Absolutely.
that feels like a win. And certainly families are drowning under the burden of tuition. And so that question of why would I have another kid? Because then I'm definitely staying home and then my career's on hold. And, it's like those choices that people are making. I think any assistance, will be welcome. And I think in this bill, it's interesting too, how many people will be eligible for financial assistance. So, if you're at 600% of federal poverty, making $180,000 a year, you think you're not going to get a benefit. Like we've often talked about that cliff or where, suddenly you're not eligible for anything. I think that, that will be such a huge relief to families that, and then the question will be, do we have the capacity? Because we don't right now. So suddenly everybody will have help paying for it, but we have to shore up the system in other ways too. And how quickly will that translate? That's going to be tricky.
That's a really interesting part of this, I think. So, a lot more families will gain benefits from this. Absolutely. As we move that scale up. I agree. I think there's a lot more sort of willingness to pay. I think it's, the conversation is starting to get much clearer in terms of like folks feel really comfortable with K-12 education being a public good. And so I think folks are getting much more comfortable with the idea of, birth to 5 education being a public good, right? But so we flood the system with money essentially. And how long does it take for a system that's flooded with money to actually stabilize? We don't know. And I think that is that sort of question of how long does it take a system flooded with money to stabilize is why that extra study is in the Senate bill. Mm-hmm. There are huge, huge is probably an overstatement, huge by Vermont standards, but like very nice loan forgiveness programs that are now sort of built in for early care and education that would help people enter that workforce, but that takes a little while. How long does it take for people's sort of vision of this as a sustainable career when they're in college or looking for a new job? How long does a career need to pay a living wage for people to start actually like imagining it as something sustainable in their lives? I don't know. It's a really good question. I think there's also that gap between who isn't accessing care right now and might need it, I think is a very, very squishy number. The RAND study put it much lower than some of the Let's Grow Kids studies that I've seen before.
Right.
And so it's not clear to me how many more spots are needed.
Yeah, and I think again, post-COVID, what we're seeing is we have a wait list. And, so in the fall, when we open that 5th classroom, there are probably 3 or 4 families who said they were ready, did their visits, didn't end up coming. Like, I think families are still in this space and place of like trying to figure out how to be in this world. And so I think I think that's a good point. The demand is an interesting question, part of the equation that I don't think we know very well. And right now it's actually interesting talking about there's the community revitalization grant program and part of it's focused on childcare. And I wouldn't take any money right now to expand childcare because I couldn't, again, like I just said, I closed the classroom. So it's both people entering the field, and then those of us in the field who are, when are we going to take that risk to add more, or, put that energy or have that bandwidth to do it. So
there's some cart and horse happening.
Yeah, it's a really complicated equation. What was really successful during the pandemic, and it's actually about to end, and there were grants. Emily referenced the grants during COVID that just came to programs, so I think we've been getting like $4,000 a month for, there are a couple different series of it, but I think this one's been for about a year and it's about to run out. And we just started thinking about like, oh, this, we were able to raise wages because of this money, and now it's going away. And so, but that kind of like money directly for these things, targeted, like some gap funding for, as we get through some of these changes would be important. Some flexible, not flexible, I mean targeted, like the bonuses. Everybody in the early learning center who worked full time got $1,000 in December. That was a great program. That absolutely kept people in the field, and that's a lot of money for some of the folks who work in the field. So things like that to get us through while we figure out what the market's going to do, I think would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. And I think all the versions of the bill that have sort of been worked through in the building, in the legislature, have some sort of like massive boost of just sort of like cash payouts this year, next year, as we build out what sort of doing this through childcare financial assistance might look like. But it is sort of interesting. It's one of these systems where we're very clear that like money is the problem. But then once there is money in the system, are we going to find that there's another problem? And the House version of this bill has these property tax credits and tax credits built into it, as if one of the main costs was sort of the cost of infrastructure. Excuse me. And that's not a challenge that I've ever heard for centers before. The cost of maybe converting a space, yes. But the cost of the actual space, no. In the grand scheme of childcare problems, no. But it's like, how many different directions can we throw money at the problem from, and maybe we'll solve it?
Yeah.
Versus like, what are sort of the strategic steps we need to make? And I think this bill actually does start to meld some of those conversations together.
Well, Chloe, if you don't mind, because you have been working on this issue for so long, and you have such a great ground view of the landscape, what would be your first 3 steps, to start building capacity, to stabilize the system? Like, where would you put money as a professional working in the system?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's just wages. That as I just said, it's the way we keep people here. And so what we're finding is it's kind of exciting. Actually, we have some young people who didn't think that they wanted to get into early care and education, and maybe they won't stay, but they take a child development class, and then we offer to help pay for their loan programs. But we pay a lot for people to do professional development because we believe that that's really important. And I think some of them will stay. That we sort of caught them, because you don't get in this field to make, we want people to have a living wage, but you're not going to get rich, right? It's like you have to be pretty passionate about it. And so how do we, invite people to try it out? And honestly, we have, I'm just going through my head of our new hires, it's not seasoned professionals that we've gotten. It's young people ready to, and they're great. They're energetic and excited, and, really, so I think being able to entice people with sign-on bonuses and more money is really where I would focus my energy, because we won't have everybody suddenly can pay for childcare and we won't have any. Sort of like, so yeah, and I think my other observation about childcare, so it'll be 16 years that I'm here in July, and it is many times over the past 16 years, I thought it'll settle down over there eventually. I think over there, like in the early learning center, like it'll get calm eventually. It just isn't. It's just a field that it's fast moving. Something's happening. And it's so, if you think about it, people who are teachers, we're all somebody's kid, or we're parents ourselves, or it just brings together it's a really interesting kind of work that we do, or it brings up your own childhood stuff, or, and so there's always something happening. And so I think, this is not a super formed thought, but what are the support systems for programs and centers? So like in our region, we have the Windham County Early Childhood Educators Co-op, right? And family-based centers and family-based programs get together once a month and support each other. And certainly in our program, we are fortunate to have, we build in like planning time for teachers, or, so some of those, making it sustainable, because it's really hard work. And I don't know what that would look like, but that would be another investment, like another benefit that I would make sure is in the system, because it's really, I couldn't be in a classroom all day. Like, I'm not an early educator, actually. I never was. Being a parent was enough, So really having a lot of respect for the level of energy and investment it takes in figuring out how to support people to do that, not just through pay, but through a full compensation that helps them, sort of make it workable.
I think I appreciate that, Chloe, so much. Yeah. I feel so hyper aware of all of the feelings and stress and trauma that, and just processing that small children in their small bodies with their big hearts and minds are bringing into a space, and how much that means that an adult working in that space needs to hold and process and navigate and co-regulate with, and how someone who is living in chronic stress themselves because of perhaps poverty, because of the low wages, or whatever their own life experience is that brought them in, to today, has to do in order to like really stay richly aligned with the work. It seems just, I could never do it. I have so much love and appreciation for those who do. Yeah. And so one of the things I've really appreciated about the conversations I've had with you about this work over the last decade, is this idea of, there's childcare, and that's what we call it because it's easier words to use for normal people when we're talking to normal people. But it's the early care and education system isn't just childcare. It's all of the people that all are part of that circle. It's like the deep relationships with parents, so that what happens, at the center and what happens at home are integrated. And so the family feels welcome and part of the process. There's like, the wraparound mental health supports and behavioral health supports, so that children with all of their big feelings and hearts can stay in their classrooms. It's learning supports, it's nutrition supports, and it's all the supports for the providers. And, it's like, it's the housing supports, it's the whole package. And I think that's the dream, that sort of community environment and all of those people all working together, encircling a family with the child at the center of it. I think that's the dream we have for our public school system, but it's a dream that is often really realized in an early care and education setting. And there's so much that our public school system could learn from our early care and education settings. And I want to make sure that that is a piece that we don't lose track of as we're sort of pouring the necessary money into the system, that we're not just talking about teachers, but we're talking about everyone who's sort of part of that network.
Mm-hmm.
Good point. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's so true. And I care about childcare a lot. And you're right, Emily, I say childcare because it's easy and people know what I'm saying, but it's really this, what I find really interesting is that whole system, the early childhood system, even though we can't call it a system, but like when we think about the pieces of children's integrated services and early care and learning programs and how we help connect the dots with families, that really is, I think exciting. And so having this part of that system, childcare, be bolstered to step up, be a more full partner in that, or able to show up maybe even more fully because it's better resourced. That's pretty exciting. So.
We have just a couple minutes left. Thank you for both of those comments, both of you. I do just want to tie up one loose thread, I think, that has gotten a lot of press. And I think, Emily, you and I talked briefly when we were talking about paid family medical leave, is S56 had sort of commingled with the paid family leave, and there was some discussion about how that was going to work. And I'm just wondering, like, where are we with that
That's just
technicality?
Yeah, that was just politics. That wasn't policy.
Okay.
So, and like, not to say, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I'm saying it was put in the bill as an act of politics in a negotiation between the House and the Senate. It was not put into the bill because it's an essential part of the early care and education system, or what any of the folks who are sort of at the table and have been advocating for this systems reform and expansion for all this time have been asking for. Most folks who are involved in early care and education think that we need comprehensive family medical leave insurance. Absolutely. But it is not a solution to our childcare problems. It is a solution to the fact that we have a society that doesn't value care. But I'd say, like, that being in the bill or not being in the bill is politics and not policy. And so I'm going to just sort of like end my thoughts on it there.
Nope, but that's good to know. That's good for people to understand, because if you were to just look at the bill or to look at some of the conversations around the bill, it could be confusing.
And I would say, like, I'm excited, and when they did that, I was like, oh, this is great. This means the Senate is going like all in and saying like, yes, we really care about family leave. Great. Like, yes. But we all stick things in different bills in order to negotiate conversations all the time. It's like one of the sillier and funner parts of the work.
I'm so glad that you want to do the work, Emily. Thank you for your I could not do that. I have no patience for that. So thank you.
So the bill is currently, S56 is currently with the House Committee on Human Services. Do we know where it's going next?
Yeah, so simultaneous to it being in the House Committee on Human Services, the House Education Committee is taking testimony on pre-K and the pre-K system, which is, again, slightly separate from the early care and education system, unfortunately, and is actually administered by a different agency than early care and education is. And then the House Ways and Means Committee is taking testimony on financing. And so we're actually all working simultaneously, so that when the Human Services Committee can have extra time with the bill, so that when they send it to Ways and Means, we'll be sort of like ready for it and ready to take action. And then from there, it would go to House Appropriations, but just for like a day, and then it would hit the House floor. Definitely, it's very likely that whatever happens in the House will not exactly match what the Senate did. Which is always true, but particularly true with huge policy issues like this.
Okay.
And particularly the House, because our districts are smaller, tend to have a little bit more sort of like hands-on feedback from the providers in our area on any given issue, or the experts in our area on a given issue, or the parents in our area on any given issue. So we tend to get like a little more micro on things. So anyway, there's going to need to be time for a committee of conference to negotiate the differences between the two bills.
Thank you. Chloe, what do we want to leave listeners with as we head out around childcare or around this bill? What do you think it's good for people to understand right now?
I think it's good for people to understand that we need to invest in children if we want our state to keep growing and thriving. And if we want young people to come here or young people to stay here, that this is such an integral part of that. And so that public investment pays dividends that we can't even really imagine. So it's an investment. It's so trite. Ugh. It's an investment in the future, but it is, it's like, it's important for us to be thinking forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. And if people want to learn more about Winston Prouty, where can they go?
WinstonProuty.org on the web, or come visit. Come walk around on the trails. It's beautiful.
Wonderful. Hey, Emily, how about you? Where can people find out more if they want to know?
Go to emilykornheiser.org, and you'll find links to all my social media, upcoming events, or a few different ways to get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you. And of course, the Montpelier Happy Hour will return on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, on Friday at 2, or because we're fancy and drive time-ish, 8 a.m. on Wednesdays will be the rebroadcast. Hey, everyone, have a great weekend.